So welcome again to this first of a series on environmental justice with David Deese. And we're so pleased to have David do this program because not only do you know him as a First Church in Belmont member, a long-term member, having just successfully been the chair of the search committee that brought Chris Jablonski to us. But he also has the expertise to do this program. He is a professor in the Boston College Political Science Department and researches the international and comparative politics of energy and climate policies worldwide. So we are really so grateful to David for doing this series. And so I'm going to now turn it over to David, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of the logistics of the session tonight.
John Bell was willing to be commissioned to come tonight, visit us. And so I'll talk very briefly about logistics, but I'm very pleased that he's here. You all know John. He's a great friend, a long-term member, a Buddhist Dharma teacher. Did a great series last fall on kindness. And I loved his presentation, his visit for Earth Day last spring. So I'm really happy that he's agreed to start us off with this. And in that spirit, the resources and knowledge of just this group here, and never mind our larger parish, is phenomenal in this regard. So this is really intended to be a community project. I mean, as I look around the screens, all of you in one way or another are involved. And as I mentioned, we were basking in forest bathing just a couple of weeks ago in St. Island. Thank you, Nicole. And I'm beginning to think we should call it also forest caring too. So, but anyway, the logistics are just the same old boring Zoom logistics. Please be patient if my internet connection is slightly unstable. Lillian and I have tested it. If there are some instabilities, they tend to be brief. You're probably using gallery view. If you aren't, you might enjoy that. If you need to, exit and get up and move around, it's probably helpful to shut the video off. And if you want to mute during the presentation, that's terrific too. Lillian is going to monitor the chat function for us so that as we go, I want to have John sort of specify whether he wants to take questions as he goes or at the end. But if you want to put anything in chat as we go, Lillian will keep an eye on that for us, make sure we don't lose track of it. And again, the email I sent out yesterday just gives the quick list of the 6 sessions, but the next one, the second, will be October 13th. It'll be kind of, the state of the states, Massachusetts, town, local. Downing has very kindly agreed to start us off, and also Phil Thayer. So that'll be a great drawing on our resources again in the second session. So John.
Hi, everybody. You might, sometimes I like gallery view, and sometimes I like when a speaker is speaking to put it on speaker view so they come right into your living room there. So it's up to you, but I have so many old friends here. Wonderful to see you. I've known some of you for decades, and folks I don't know, glad to meet you. I'm glad you're here. I know you are caring, loyal, intelligent, well-informed, sophisticated, committed to justice. And most of us here, looking around, are older. So we've been through stuff, wars in our lives, social upheavals, political turmoil, some personal tragedy for some of us. And now here we are at our age, scared and heartbroken at the suffering of the world and in so much peril. And this is, I think, why we're here. I first want to honor your, let me just make sure, I have to set a timer here to make sure that yeah. Some of you, I just want to honor what you're already doing, how you're caring for the earth, all the ways you're already serving. Some of you may have listened to or read a written version of the sermon I gave for Earth Day at Chris's request, in which I, explored 3 questions with folks. 1, how do we fall in love with Mother Earth over and over again so that we nurture our embeddedness, our connection with the natural world? 2, how do we face the immensity of the environmental suffering and let our hearts break open without getting overwhelmed and shut down? And 3, how does each of us take responsibility for protecting and healing the earth? And David thought I might reprise some of that. I would like to offer a few different observations, some of which come out of those 3 questions. David has put together a program mainly looking at the climate science, what's facing us, coming down the pike in terms of damage and suffering, what's happening on the local, state, federal, and global level to try to mitigate that, interrupt it, so it's not the worst. All of those are vitally important. What I want to focus us on to start with is the inner dimension. It's not all out there, it's also in here with us. I'm assuming you're here because you know there's something deeply wrong, something out of kilter, deeply, and that this decade matters, and that you feel drawn to respond with love and action. And that's why you're here to learn and to take the next steps. A lot of you are already involved in this. So, there's a toxic brew of conditions that are diminishing the possibility of a livable future for humans and many other life forms. That's heartbreaking, scary. So how do we hold this situation from a spiritual point of view, from a deeper dimension? And I want to just sort of note things we already know from different wisdom traditions. So from our UU tradition, each of the principles apply to the climate situation, but just highlighting that we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every single person. That means the Koch brothers, the Trump supporters, all the climate deniers, all the Exxon officials, and the people like ourselves. We're in this world together, and we play different roles. But if we respect the inherent worth and dignity, we have to include them. The other one, which we say on Sundays, life is a gift for which we are grateful. We gather in community to celebrate the glories and the mysteries of this great gift, to keep that close to us.
Mm-hmm.
From Buddhism, which is my other practice, there are many, many teachings, but there are 3 that I just wanted to kind of underline here. Nothing lasts, and everything is interrelated. Impermanence rules, and there's no independent existence of anything that's not connected to the whole web of life. One of our UU principles, that we honor the web of life. Another Buddhist teaching which is relevant to this situation is that Buddha identified what he called 3 poisons, which give rise to all of the suffering in the world. He identified them as greed, hatred, sometimes called ill will, and delusion of a separate existence. And you can see why that last one is the key one. Because if we think we're separate from each other or the natural world, then we can do things to it rather than being part of it and knowing that we're hurting ourselves. And the last Buddhist thing, which I wanted to just highlight here among the millions, is there's a saying that the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows exist side by side. and we're asked to embrace them all. Not an easy teaching. Another touchstone quote for me is a physicist, David Bohm, who described reality as unbroken wholeness in flowing movement. Unbroken wholeness in flowing movement. There's no separation. It's impossible for us to actually be outside of the web of existence, even though we feel that sometimes. From the climate science, we have a 5-part message in brief. It's bad. Some of it's irreversible. We humans are the cause. There is hope to interrupt it before the worst happens. And 98% of climate scientists agree on the first 4. Two other ones. I once read a report from a European anthropologist who spent lots of time in the indigenous tribe in the Amazon, where they would talk to the animals and the plants, get messages, and know, there'd be a relationship there. And he went through his ceremonies using the ayahuasca and other plants and found that he too could do it. And he came back and wrote, he said, "We Westerners think we're running the show, but we don't even know what the show is." And I thought, yes, it's so much vaster than we humans know about. And the last sort of touch point for me is Martin Luther King's famous statement, all meaningful and lasting change begins on the inside. So in relation to the environmental situation, there's some themes that we know about. I'd just like to kind of highlight them. We know there's a lot of fear and anxiety burning right now, both individually and collectively. The media is finally paying attention, but they're coming at us with lots of horror stories every day. Even the front page of the New York Times now has bad news stories, hardly any good news, and it gets worse. Joanna Macy, a famous eco-psychologist and Buddhist student and wonderful teacher, she says, we're on this narrow path, working our way towards a better future. There are 2 ditches on either side, ditch on either side. On one side is the ditch of despair, overwhelm, feelings of powerlessness, which we want to avoid. On the other side is the ditch of urgency and reactivity, which we want to avoid. Both of them keep us from being less effective. I want to say a little bit about the term climate change. I don't use that term as much anymore. I used to, but it's much bigger than climate change. I talk about things like ecological devastation or the desecration of the natural world. Because even if we were able magically to turn off carbon emissions now, a lot of ecological devastation would still continue. Population growth is pushing into the habitats of animals and species and destroying it. The industrial food complex to feed the world is depleting the soil and using up the water in the aquifers. All kinds of things that are happening that have very little to do with, but are reinforced by the greenhouse emissions and global warming. But it's bigger than that. And there are these intertwined crises, the pandemic, racism. And I think, what's interesting is that there is a, so climate crisis is also a racial justice crisis, an immigration crisis, a food security crisis, a national security crisis, a financial security crisis, a land rights crisis, and everything that we care about is connected to the environmental destruction. And the silver lining, if you can call it that, is that there's a chance to build coalitions across things that we thought of as separate issues prior to this. And I think all of these crises are have a, I don't want to be simplistic here, but I think it could be said that there is a single crisis. And that is the crisis of broken relationships. Broken relationships with ourselves, with one another, with other relationships, with species in the natural world, and dare I say, with the cosmic dimension. That we're out of touch with the true nature of who we are as human beings. Robin Wall Kimmerer, a Potawatomi indigenous leader and also botanist at Cornell, I think. She has a beautiful way of saying, she says, you know, in the Western way of thinking, we humans are on top and the plants are on the bottom. But she said, really, it's the other way around. We're the youngest species. We have the most to learn, and the plants and the trees have been here for zillions of years, and we have much to learn from them. Interesting and more humble perspective, I think. So healing all these different relationships is necessary part of healing the damage done to the earth. They're not separable. There are two dimensions. The Buddhists teach about two dimensions of reality. They call it the historical reality and the ultimate reality. Sometimes the metaphor used is the wave in the ocean. So a wave exists, it has a certain amplitude and character and duration and impact. And sometimes, but when it has its lifespan, so to speak, and then it falls back into the ocean from which it arises. So if we think of ourselves as the wave and we get identified with it, and we say, well, I'm a better wave than you, I'm more impactful, I'm longer than you are, I'm going to go on longer than you are, and you're just a puny little wave, or I'm a puny wave and I don't know what I'm doing here. Then all kinds of, problems, our small little identification makes us suffer. And we forget that we actually come from a common ocean. It gives rise to everything that is. The glories and mysteries of this great gift. And that helps me understand, it's not all about us humans. We're naturally attached to the world that we know, to our life form, to having it the way we want it to be. But nature is much bigger than that. It doesn't necessarily go along with our agenda. So there's a certain humility that's helpful. We matter, we are infinite, we're vast. A nice phrase from Walt Whitman. You say I contradict myself? So be it, I contain multitudes. So the technical fixes are important, but they won't bring us home if we're not also doing the internal work of mending our relationships and having a perspective which helps us stay calm and avoid the ditch on either side. I just wanted to share with you a couple of practices that I have found useful for myself in handling, in having a balanced view in relation to climate change. First is to cultivate an ennobling, empowering narrative about it. And it's good to check, what are we telling ourselves about this? What are we saying to other people? Are we beyond the tipping point? It's too bad, humans messed it up. Sorry about that, better luck next time. Or do we say, hey, maybe life is offering us just the right size challenge to help us evolve to a higher level of consciousness. Woohoo, let's have at it. Let's do it with joyfulness and excitement. As hard as it is possible to face suffering in a way that is empowering. Another one is, so we have to heal our hurts and our early trauma. You know, the thing that helps me is to remember that the feelings that I have of powerlessness and overwhelm and despair and anger about the climate situation, they were there long before I knew anything about that. They came from, you know, my early childhood, my inheritance, generational stuff. And and if I didn't have a chance to heal it when I was going through it back as a child or young person, then I internalize a certain level of powerlessness. And so I look at something like poverty or racism and climate, and I say, oh my God, it's just too big. We can't do it. But that is because we're underneath this blanket of stuff that's still dogging us, even at our age, I think. Even though those of us who've done amazing things are still only working at this much of our potential, our human potential, that we would see if we freed ourselves from this, the early trauma. Not easy to do, but necessary. So the other is to contemplate impermanence. Here's an example. The most hugest environmental catastrophe happened when an organism gave off a noxious gas, spread around the entire globe, filled every niche, killed off 90% of the life forms at that point. This happened 2.8 billion years ago. The organism was bacteria, and the gas was oxygen, thereby creating the conditions for human beings to eventually evolve. So things are changing in nature, in our own bodies, we know that. In our country, nothing lasts. Our civilization won't last. Human species may not last. There are more species gone now than exist now. So we're part of a much larger thing. And, you know, again, we are attached to our particular view of things, and that's understandable. But if we can loosen my own opinions, loosen my point of view, then I have a chance to be more flexible, think more clearly, listen to people who are different. Which brings me to practicing loving kindness towards those whose view different from ours. I once asked my meditation group during the 2016 presidential election, there were like 15, 18 Republicans running. I asked my group which Republican candidate they had the most compassion for. And it was a difficult question, you know, but wouldn't we like all the people who have a different point of view to be happy, to have a peacefulness about them? Wouldn't you like Mitch McConnell to be happy? You know, I think of Plum Village as the retreat center. I'd like Donald Trump to have a 6-month sojourn at Plum Village with the monastics, you know, because he too wants to be free of whatever the suffering makes him do, the dangerous and despicable things that he does. But he is part of the human family, and he is our brother. So part of this is transforming racism, also huge divisive thing in our society, we know. Angel Kyoto Williams, who's an African-American Zen teacher, beautifully links it when she says, the reason we continue to degrade the earth is that we continue to degrade each other. Such a beautiful linking of racism and climate destruction, I think. A couple more things. Whenever I feel better than, worse than, intimidated by, scared of, superior to, want to get away from another person or another group, I can be sure that I'm caught in what I call habits of separation. We've been conditioned to feel separate from each other, individual, not like you, my tribe, not your tribe. And I remember being in an airport once and making up stories about people as I was waiting for the plane. You know how you do that? They were not positive stories. And I thought, what am I doing here? I don't even know these folks. So I created a little mantra for myself, which I use now quite a bit. I said, this is my home. This airport right now is my home. This is my home, and these are my people. This is my home, and these are my people. And right away, I became more tender. I was interested in them. I wanted to know about them. And it changed my relationship. So wherever I go and I feel like, ugh, don't belong here, I just say, this is my home, and these are my people. What can I learn here? To do this, we have to have ways of training our mind, because our minds are reflexive and they're conditioned to disapprove and approve, to judge and to include and exclude, and this is right and that's wrong. And that just keeps us in separation a lot. So we have to have methods, meditation, prayer, healing, centering prayer, whatever we do, to stop the chatter of our mind, to slow down, to listen to the quiet, clear voice inside. I'm just going to say a couple more things and then have time for questions and comments and sharing of your own practices. Living ethically is really important. I know probably everybody here tries to be a mindful consumer, used kind speech, generosity, not stealing credit, not stealing the show, that we have reverence for life. These are all built into our Unitarian practice. And the last thing is the Bobby McFerrin song, "Don't Worry, Be Happy." It's a very good reminder for us, I think. You know, it's possible to work to relieve suffering and have joy and generosity, to see it as a great human adventure to try to, you know, bring us through this dark time. We may not succeed, don't know, but why not have a fun doing it as much as we can? Why not, you know, express love in everything we do? Because the transformation we seek in our environmental situation is not just out there. It's not just with the technical and structural fixes. It's not just in our politics. It's not just in changing an economic system that's based on greed and growth. These are all vitally important part of the picture. It's also how we show up from moment to moment, because we impact all those systems. People are watching, you know, listening, even when we're not aware of it. And all the ways that we show up impact the political sphere and the practical sphere. For instance, the more of us who eat less meat or drive an electric car, the market responds, which then in turn promotes government policies and legislation to incentivize the production of plant-based food or electric vehicles. So it's all part of the interconnection of everything. So as we speak out about injustice or engage in direct action or call out corruption and dishonesty, all of which are important, can we do it without demonizing, blaming, or shaming? Can we use kind speech? Can we see no human enemy, only human hurt or ignorance? Can we engage in respectful dialogue? I like a quote from poet and playwright W.H. Auden, who said, "Love your crooked neighbor with all your crooked heart." So the last thing, I just want to leave you with a little song. Years ago, I took an old tune and put words to it that go like this. It was actually the tagline in the back of Tikkun magazine. See if I can sing it. Inner healing, social transformation, go together on the path to liberation. Sister and brother, you can't have one without the other. So thank you very much for listening, for being here. Really want to invite anybody who wants to unmute yourself, share your own question or your own practice, which helps you. How do you ground yourself in an inner or spiritual dimension as you face the ecological crisis?
Well, I would just like to say thank you for acknowledging that we need to honor all of the people, and it is difficult to think of people who we consider as other. And that's definitely something that I think a lot of people around the globe need to take to heart, because things have just gotten so challenging politically here and across the globe. So that's something that hopefully more people can be inspired to do so.
After the January 6th insurrection, I wrote a six-page love letter to the insurrectionists because I tried to see if I could reach across, because I too think the system is rigged. I too am mad at everything. I too have been there. I too have yelled at the police. I too have been arrested. I too have been said, no more. So, there's common ground there in terms of that. My analysis of why is different from theirs, but I just thought, let's try this. And so I sent it to two of my Republican Trump supporting friends to see how it would land before I distributed it. And we had a back and forth, each one of us independent of the other. And it was interesting for a while. And then when I asked them, what would your solutions be? There was radio silence. They were more into wanting to blame the other than to really engage in what would it take to change. But it was a good exercise. I never distributed. I'm happy to send it to you if you want to see an example of an attempt to have compassionate dialogue. Thank you, Nicole.
I thought Monty had a question.
You're on mute, Monty.
Hi, John, and
Hi.
hello, hi, everybody. I wanted to pick up on the Unitarian recognition of the inherent dignity and honor of each person, and link that with what you were saying about our inclination to separate things, and link it also with the picture you were painting about how we think of ourselves as being on top and plants at the bottom. But the truth of the matter is that it's the other way around. And so my takeaway, and really one of my core beliefs, is that we need to, or that all life forms have inherent worth and dignity. Every life form that is currently on our planet has just as long an evolutionary history as we do. They've all had to bump off the edges and evolve to survive in changing environments, and that's just so remarkable and so admirable. So I guess my hope is that we can broaden the recognition of inherent dignity and worth beyond just humans, and recognize that it applies to all the other life forms as well.
I am delighted to hear all of your enthusiasm for this particular topic, because we are going to have a program on this. And so, it's going to happen sometime later this fall with a panel discussion on exactly diving deep into the first principle of the inherent worth and dignity of all beings. So look for that coming.
Hi, Bob.
When I used to go to conferences where they would teach us things, one of the people would say afterwards, Bob, I was talking to the group. The main thing I had to do was tell them what to do on Monday. I agree with everything you're saying. It is rich and it's seamless and it is uplifting. Converting that to an action plan for me to do something on Monday, or converting it to an action plan that I can tell my granddaughter what she should do on Monday, becomes a complicated decision-making process. If you were tasked on a Sunday to tell people what to do on Monday, what are the things that they can do with their lives to make a change?
I guess I approach it differently. In the Buddhist understanding, there's a concept called interbeing. Everything is related to everything else. And we know this in ecology. Everything has a niche, plays a role. So you take one of those out and things start to change. And if I don't think it's a concept, I think it's a universal truth. Interconnection is a truth. And if that's true, I mean, since I think that's true, there's a way in which it doesn't matter where we start. If we know that it's all connected, if you start to pull the thread, it's going to get everywhere. So I think people are more likely to stay involved if they start with what is their passion, what they care about, what they love. Maybe it's a, you know, you listen to environmentalists interviewed about how they got started. It's because they loved some part of the natural world. You know, the forest that got clear cut to make a parking lot or a mall. The stream they used to fish in that's now polluted. I read Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land or something like that, where she lived with people in the bayous in Louisiana. Loved the cypress trees in the bayous. Really mad now that the fossil fuel industry has polluted it with the oil sludge. So things like that. If you care, this is why falling in love with the earth or some being or part of it is the way in. It's the doorway to your own self-motivated action. And we can't determine that for other people, I don't think. They have to come to that themselves. We have a linear sort of maybe colonialist attitude that we have to have a master plan and work it, and there are leverage points and what's the most important thing to do. And that constrains us, I think. Not that that isn't important, and some people can do that well. I'm a good big picture thinker. I like to know where what I'm doing here fits into the bigger picture. But I don't think you need that. If we start where we are and keep the climate always in mind, we'll find ways of expanding it and making it more and more aware. You know, who are any of us to say this is what you should do? The Buddhist Peace Fellowship, which is an activist arm of Buddhism, has a nice, simple framework. They call it the three B's: block, build, be. So sometimes we have to block the harm. We have to go to Minnesota and stop the pipeline. And let's all go there because it's imminent. If we can stop this, then we stop the tar sands, the production, because there's no way to get it to the coast. Critical piece. But that doesn't change the system inherently. So then we also, the second build part is we have to build up in a decaying structure new ways of growing food or doing banking or providing housing or taking care of each other or alternative fuel sources. All these things are building new things inside the collapsing system. But that doesn't necessarily hold unless we're also changing our consciousness. We're doing the be part. We're being and expanding our knowledge of who we are as human beings. We can put up all kinds of solar panels and wind turbines. But if we haven't dealt with internal greed, for instance, we'll just want more things. We'll deplete the Earth's resources in other ways. We'll drive more places and fly all over. So that it's not one thing. It's like an integrated, emotional healing, social justice, spiritual practice. All these things are interrelated. The practical side, the political side, and the personal side are integrated. I hope I'm making sense. I know it's a long, roundabout way, Bob, but I don't think we can point to one thing. Jean, go ahead.
Thank you, John, for that. What that made me think about, though, is I love the Buddhist perspective that you brought up there, but there are other cultures and practices that are not necessarily about the here and now. It's about the afterlife, or it's somewhere else. It's not it's
Yeah.
not now. It's striving for paradise is not here on earth, and so how do we act still together when sometimes the concepts of what's important here and now are different, because what people are their viewpoints are their source of authority may be different, or what they look for, and it's like, okay, right, well, it doesn't really matter because there's this afterlife, and and so it's not so much about this, and I don't know all about all the world religions. I mean, the Buddhist perspective sounds great on this, but how do we,
Yes.
as a world, deal with this when we have
Right. I
different
mean, one of
philosophies?
the narratives out there is, the folks who say it's in God's hands, or bring on the rapture because we're going to the promised land and all those infidels will suffer. Sure, there are those viewpoints, but if you have a personal conversation with somebody who has that point of view about their children and what they want for their children in this life now, they're going to come to some common ground with me, I think. And so that's where I start. It's like, there's a beautiful movie I just saw, not on climate stuff, on race stuff, called The Best of Enemies. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's about a real life situation, a dramatization of a real life situation. It happened in 1971, I think, 72, in Durham, North Carolina, where they had a school desegregation conflict. And they brought in somebody to run a charrette. They had equal number of blacks and equal number of whites. And the chairperson of the white group was the local KKK head. And the chairperson of the black group was the feisty, no nonsense, take no prisoners, black civil rights woman. And they hated each other. But they got to know each other through this process of a moderated, calm deliberation. They got to know each other's children. They actually became friends, and he, in front of everybody, after this week, it was only a week-long process, he was a deciding vote. It was 5-5. He was a deciding vote. And in front of everyone, he stood up and said, I joined the KKK because I felt unappreciated. No one cared about me. They gave me a home. They felt I was important. They gave me a role. I felt like I was somebody. And I was taught the wrong things about Black people, the wrong things. And he said, here's my membership card. And he tore it up. I don't need this to feel that way anymore. And he and she became very good friends for life. And they traveled the country talking about how to have dialogue across these difficult situations. So I just think there are there are examples of where that's happened, and we have to have faith that it's possible. Not in all situations. I'm not Pollyanna that everyone can be converted like that. But redemption is something we hold out for. The story of John Newton, the slave ship captain, brought many cargo of Africans from Africa to become enslaved. And at midpoint in one of these sails, he realized he had a religious experience. I realized I was totally wrong. He sailed back, released the Africans, sailed back to England, where he's from, became a minister, wrote hymns, one of which was Amazing Grace. So redemption is always out there as a possibility. One more thing I just want to say. We sometimes feel like we're in this battle alone. I mean, us humans. And us humans looking at the climate crisis, and oh my God. Well, maybe we're not alone. Maybe we're not, maybe there are other forces, other energies, other in the vast unknown part of existence, which are rooting for us. There's an expression in the Black community, Mama don't raise no fools. Well, maybe Mama Earth don't raise no foolish species. Maybe we've been created exactly in some unknown, I'm not getting a little out here, but in some unknown way to help move this species to a higher level of understanding of our interconnection. Wouldn't that be nice? Joanna Macy, I heard her interviewed. She's like 92, been out there for a long time. She said, yeah, there's something called the Buddhaverse we talk about in Buddhism. She said the Buddhaverse is filled with beings who just can't wait to come back and help us. Maybe this is true if we open to that we're not just doing this ourselves.
Or is it hubris that we just think we're the highest level species and maybe we just need to get killed off and let the earth do its thing?
Yeah, I mean, so many species would be very happy if we were gone. But I don't think that we're the cancer. We're young. We're making mistakes. Nobody woke up 200 years ago and said, or today and said, I want to make species go extinct by burning fuel or coal. It just was we wanted to be warmer. We wanted to have things easier. So we developed things, and its unintended consequences now hooked to an economic system built on greed and ever expanding growth. And those are not sustainable. So David, you'll have to call it when you want this part to end so you can have your slideshow, but it's up to you. This is a rich
Suppose we should
conversation.
move on, but always if there's one more question, you use. Well, John, that's remarkable, way beyond your birthday offering. Just really a wonderfully broad and deep framework, a way of approaching this, and a challenge to me, at least.
Mhm.
I'm really grateful.
You're welcome. This is fun to talk about this level of our work together.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, everyone.
So, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully work through some of these slides, which hopefully you can see now. Does that work for everybody? And Lillian's gonna monitor chat.
Yep.
And I'm trying to figure out also how to keep everyone. But will you, in addition to hands, if you have a question or comment, speak up? Because I mean, at this point, it's a long slide set. I prefer either to do questions and comments as we go and cover part of it, or maybe to go through a substantial part and then stop. But I want to make sure that we have discussion and questions. That's the point of the exercise. This first shot is flooding in Indonesia. The second one is intentional burning of marshlands on the eastern shore of Maryland to try to make the land more robust and rigorous against the floods and the coming damage of climate change. And this is going the long walk for water in Africa. That, of course, is getting longer. So what I wanted to do tonight was briefly, again, it's a long slide set, but to just get a sense of where you folks are, and also in some cases go through several slides pretty quickly, see what's more or less interesting, but to kind of go back very briefly with a little bit of history, a little bit of the effects now, what we're seeing. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is already a big glimpse into the future. And then, of course, what do we want to do about it? And then end with a couple of slides and definitely some discussion about what we can do individually. So these are probably pretty familiar graphs. And I don't think in our case, we really need to think all that much about what's happened in the last couple centuries. This is the very longer term view. It's a graph you've probably seen of CO2 concentrations. This is a little bit easier to look specifically at what's happened just since 1950. That gives you a historical view. And again, if you look at all of the basic charts, they all pretty much overlap and tell the same picture. There's no real disagreement about this, what's happening. And of course, some regions are affected much more than others. We'll talk more about that in a minute. How long back does the understanding go? Well, it goes back well into the 1800s, even before this piece, but a pretty interesting slide if you get a chance to look at it later, about an authoritative piece that was written way back in 1896, recognizing the basic process and being pretty sure about what was going on. So it goes back a ways. You've probably already seen, in fact, in the last few days, there have been hearings going on in Congress about when Shell knew what was going on, who knew when and why. This is a piece that I like from Exxon's own memos, 1981, basically talking about the possibility that the global ecosystem in 2030 might be headed for very important effects. Again, sort of showing pretty clearly the recognition that was there at least 30, 35 years ago, if not 40 years ago. And this is, again, 32, 33 years ago, front page of the New York Times. Many ethicists say the year 1990 is important because that's probably the time when world leaders and thought leaders around the world should have had a clear understanding of what was going on. So at least for the past 30 years, there's some retribution, not retribution, but there's some repayments and rebalancing that needs to be done for what we've consumed of the atmospheric capacity over the last 30 years at least. We don't need to talk about human causes. That's all pretty clear. We know what's going on. There's just more evidence about the contrast of human versus natural causes from the IPCC. This one I think is more important and interesting. Often the connection is not made directly between climate change or the climate crisis, let's say, and environmental pollution, environmental injustice. And so I think it's helpful to have in mind the major sources of air pollution, which is the most direct contributor of the climate crisis to human health and ecospheric health. So I like that. This is also important. One of the most authoritative bodies to get together yet and look at the combination of pollution and health. And not only is it the largest killer of people around the world by far, even including things like tuberculosis and malaria, but that 10 times more death than war, terrorism, and all forms of violence each year. But the effects, of course, are very unequal. And it's really a lot of the lower and middle income countries that are suffering a lot of the effects of poor chemicals regulation, poor chemical disposal, and poor chemicals handling. Again, very briefly, just to show how that disease and death from pollution is distributed very unequally, not too surprising to any of you. And again, I think just very briefly, we could look specifically at how climate change will drive the change in how pollution affects health. In these ways, among others, we've just seen the flooding in Louisiana and what that's done once again in terms of chemicals and the spread of unhealthy sewage and so forth. I'm going to skip through these. If you wanted to go back later and look at, these are a series of slides that I put together on specifically how energy use affects the environment. They're pretty detailed. It's helpful just to have a kind of basic sense of where most carbon is actually locked up. For example, of all of the CO2 that we released, about 30% of that has gone into the ocean in the last decade, and a similar amount into plants and about 45% into the atmosphere. And so just knowing where the carbon is mainly locked up and where it's going is a good thing to have in mind. Also good to have in mind the really important role of land use and forestry. I have in mind a presentation in about a month by a colleague at MIT. He's agreed to come and talk about the Amazon rainforest loss and what's happening in Brazil, what the actual causes and drivers are, and what could be done about that. It's not just Brazil, of course, it's also Indonesia, Malaysia, and a lot of other countries. Again, I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this in this group because the effects are increasingly obvious. And even 2 years ago, we would have probably wanted to spend more time on this. But now we're all living it. As John just described, this is our world. And really the key thing is perhaps to help recognize where climate change is most directly involved and where it isn't involved. But in these several ways, at least, we know that the climate crisis is creating much more intense events. You all know about ice sheet loss, and we'll talk more about that. Flooding across high tides, and we'll talk more about the uneven effects of that. Again, if you want to kind of go back, hurricane intensity couldn't be more obvious in the last few years. It's pretty scary. And even these now are somewhat out of date because just this past hurricane season, the last 2 hurricane seasons, some have equaled these storms. And of course, the effects are uneven again. So it's helpful to look at different regions of the world and see how they're going to be affected differently. And again, I want to say something, just a couple more details about that at the end of this section. Change in weather. And again, even this is out of date. But again, you can see the parts of the country that are going to be most seriously affected. And we now have modeling that takes water availability, floods and droughts out to not just 2030, but 2050. Again, each year is out of date in terms of wildfires. And this is probably out of date in terms of the spread of Lyme disease, but one of the things that probably is underappreciated is the way in which tropical diseases are going to be spread to new areas. Coastal populations are going to be affected the most, of course, in many key ways. We're still uncovering and documenting all of the major health risks of wildfires, but as you know, they're crucial for respiratory diseases. And again, in terms of the spread of diseases to new areas and the intensification of those diseases in existing areas, it's quite concerning. So there are two, just to finish up this section on current impacts, there are two ways in which I think the journalists, the media haven't even adequately picked up on this. And the scientists are just in the last few months, we're beginning to see a lot more, in part because the UN IPCC report this summer came out and started talking much more specifically about tipping points, meaning nonlinear or change or step function changes in 12 different ways. Some of the most important ones you've probably read about: melting Arctic permafrost, depending on the rate of melting, could begin to release a lot more methane than is currently calculated into our models, because we just cannot predict exactly how fast the permafrost will melt. Again, the very large polar ice sheets, we just don't know how far the melting is going to go, but that's where the largest amount of sea rise, several meters rather than several feet, could happen. The Northern Ocean ice, again, you've probably read about this. The ice begins to go out in the northern seas of Canada earlier, and it doesn't get ever as thick again. And when it goes out earlier, the ocean now is absorbing those sun rays rather than having the ice reflected back up into the atmosphere. And that effect is also not calculated into most of the models. And so we know that that's beginning to amplify the effects. And then the second part is, you may already know the Gulf of Maine off of our coast and up towards Canada is warming at almost exactly twice the rate of the average warming of oceans worldwide. And so this is just a phenomenally different rate of change. More importantly, the Arctic, Africa, small islands, and the Asian megadeltas, of course, are ultimately going to feel the greatest effects. But again, the effects are different in different latitudes, different regions. In some cases, in the high altitudes, there's going to be a lot more frequent heavy rain events. And in the low and mid latitudes of the Earth, there are going to be more droughts. So the effects are really differential. They are varied, and the extremes are going to happen in areas that already have very hot or very humid weather. Again, I think there's been so much recently in the news that we don't have to spend a lot of time, and it can get depressing to focus on it too much. But again, just briefly, we know that we're going to be experiencing a lot more drought in the coming decades. And these are the areas that are most likely to experience the worst effects. Across middle of Africa, of course, is already having a very difficult time, and it's going to get worse.
David, could I
Yes.
interrupt for just a minute? This is
Absolutely.
John.
Absolutely.
Just to notice, as we're taking in this information, it might be a good practice just to notice what's happening in our bodies or our hearts as we take in this information. Keep breathing, try to be calm, pause from time to time. So thank you.
Thank you for that. It's not easy. That's a blurry slide, but again, just changes in precipitation. And we know that groundwater is also declining in key areas. And you probably know the vast majority of our water is used for agriculture, and so agricultural practices are going to have to change. Otherwise, we just won't be able to support as much agriculture. So there's a lot to be learned, a lot to be done there too, in decreasing water use. We know also that the entire climatic systems in parts of our country are going to change, and we can see this changing already. And it's part of the reason why we experienced the very high heat in Seattle and Oregon this summer. Again, sort of obviously the economic effects and costs are going to fall differentially in the country. This is just rough, but you'll notice that some of the states of the US that are maybe the least concerned about climate change and the least able to recognize exactly what's happening are also where some of the costs and the job losses and so forth are going to be most severe. So, yeah, sea level rise, again, it's going to depend a lot on what part of the world you live in. We know it's happening. And again, this is that whole big question about, permafrost and how fast it's melting. So moving to the more to what in fact can we do? What do we need to do? Well, we kind of know what we need to do. We know that the sooner we slow the rate of global warming, the less sea level rise there'll be. And as John talked about earlier, the less all of these effects will be. So we do have the ability to definitely to control these outcomes. But of course, each month and year that we wait, the less control we have. But generally, in general, this is the bathtub. This is, what's going in, and this is what's going out. And so, in the simplest terms, we need to increase the removals. How to do that? I think, on my list, I would say there are 4 most important things. The CO2 removal, we're doing some of that. There's a lot of investment and some speculation. And I'll just mention some ways here that we do know we can do that. Because in some ways, this is the most technologically involved way. Good news, we talked a little bit about heat pumps and whether air source heat pumps are going to be coming down at this kind of rate in terms of their costs. Maybe not, but they'll definitely be decreasing. But at least in terms of green energy, we've seen a phenomenal drop in the cost of wind and solar, electric vehicles and so forth. Yeah, I'm not going to talk right now about the scenarios in the IPCC because we'll have time to look at that later. So again, the idea is that there is a given amount of emissions that are possible within the temperature range that we're looking at. And the question is, how do we limit those? And what sorts of sources then can continue to limit if we're going to make it there? And we'll talk more about this also in a future session. One very hopeful area is reforestation. It's not just planting trees by any means, it's also protecting the existing trees that protect the soil, that hold the carbon. It's also managing forests a lot better and having a lot more respect for the role of trees and forests and how we graze and how we combine grazing in areas with trees. So there's a lot of things that are potentially, there are a lot of things already underway and a lot more that's potentially available. A lot more carbon could be taken up. Same thing for soil restoration, which is a huge problem. Again, in the areas that have been farmed the most intensively or managed less carefully. But that's a hopeful area with a lot of known technologies and capabilities. Yeah, okay, I want to stop in 5 minutes and make sure that we have time to discuss, talk about, steps. But just for a couple more minutes, prospects. Even this data is a little bit out of date, but it gives you a sense as of 3 years ago in the Trump years that people basically recognize that global warming is happening. These numbers are actually higher now. Similarly, how does that distribute by districts? West Virginia is a key state right now, a key senator. My internet connection is unstable. I hope you can still hear me. Again, you can kind of see the distribution by regions and by states. And I have a slide here that updates all of this to 2021. I want to get to. Important because now there's a lot, even more support for the US to take a leadership role in the Glasgow UN Conference of Parties that's coming up 1st in November. So this is much more recent. This is the most recent data that I could find from Pew. If you look worldwide among people who are very or somewhat concerned, there's a very clear majority willingness to change a lot. Not surprisingly, younger people, more educated people, and people that come more from the left ideologically are all more willing to change and make changes to their lifestyle. The cleavage on that is the largest in the US from left and right, not surprisingly. Young adults, if you poll people in Sweden, 65% ages 18 to 29 are very concerned about how they're going to be affected personally, and only 25% of people 65 and older. So it's quite a split there by age. Yeah, let's save the Paris Agreement for later, because we'll talk about the Glasgow negotiation that's coming up so soon. We can skip by Trump's world. And just briefly, 2 slides. One, reasons for optimism, just in terms of, even this is out of date, a larger and larger majority of all the new energy capacity installed is not fossil fuel. The problem, of course, is there's still too much fossil fuel production being added, especially coal plants in China and India. And hopefully the Glasgow conference next month will get some more commitments from them and reduce the amount of plans to build coal-fired plants. The latest offerings from a few key countries are much better. For the United States, for example, we've doubled our commitment from the Obama years, but of course, we need to double it and more in order to catch up for lost time. But it's at least encouraging to see countries generally stepping up, except for Australia and Japan. There's going to be a lot of pressure on them at Glasgow to come up with better national commitments. Yeah, reasons for concern. We know that meeting even just the 2-degree Celsius global warming is going to be a daunting challenge. And as John pointed out, we know that there are irreversible changes already. And I know, as Monty is very concerned, the loss of species and so forth is very much in the news, and even today. So just these last 2 slides, I wanted to kind of make sure that we have these 10 minutes to talk about any of your questions or discussion, and also just, to make sure that we get to the what can we do I know that one close friend of mine who is here tonight has stopped driving his car or given up the car. That's a big step. Avoiding one round trip, major airplane trip is a big step, and so forth and so on. So this is just, there are different ways of scaling this, but this is a decent cut at showing how important relative actions are. On our earlier talk, personally, I think helping people to connect and reconnect with nature is also extremely important. And that's going to be more and more important as the global population becomes more and more urban. 75% of us, even more, in 10 or 20 years will be urban. So enough on that. Comments, questions, and any discussion, of course, of what we can do.
Question. Hi, it's Jean. I guess maybe I should stop obsessing about having grandchildren then, because maybe that's better for the earth.
Well, we have to bring John back.
But one of the things that kind of bugs me the more I read into things is, do we sometimes make ourselves feel good with one solution or the other? So we talk about electric cars, and I go, okay, electric cars. Oh, lithium. Oh, South America, Argentina, Chile, Nevada. Does everyone know where their lithium is coming to, and the water and the pollution that's happening? The real earth metals and our cell phones and all these things. And so it's, yeah, we drive an electric car, but did you want to look at did the open lithium mine where your lithium battery came from? And so I feel like, where are we investing in the technology where I do one thing here, but hey, it made you feel good, but you're ripping open the earth over here to get your lithium battery. So at what cost was that at? So I hate to be like this naysayer, but it's things like that that make me say, well, do I want an electric car? Does that make me feel good? Where in actual fact, its source is horrible.
So one of the things I will definitely more before is in terms of energy sources, the way to look at that is life cycle costs. And there's really good analysis like out of NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab out west, and other academics that actually exactly take, okay, yeah, that nuclear power plant, once it's up and running, is carbon free, right? It's emissions free. But you've got to mine the fuel, you have to build that plant, and the same thing for a solar power plant or an electric vehicle. So yeah, both for energy sources and producing electricity, and then I'll look and see what else I can find too, but you have to look at the life cycle costs. And then also, what about when its life is over and it needs to be either recycled or, gotten rid of somehow. And so that has to also be calculated into it. So that it's an imperfect way of getting at it, but absolutely, that's a critical perspective. And solar as an energy source has that as a limitation. It's not carbon free because we have to look at what goes into it.
Well, until we get good battery technology for storing energy, to me, that's the linchpin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I guess the key is making energy as things are moving. Yeah, Bob.
If we just think about one metric, sea level rise, in the year 2000, it was predicted that in 100 years, sea level would rise, pick a number, 6 feet, 5 feet, anyhow, a number, unless we did something. Now, 21 years have passed. So basically, we've discounted our ability by 21%. And by the way, you say 21% is not a lot, but Eloise will only shop at TJ Maxx at racks that have at least 20% off. So 20% is a big number. what happens as it gets closer to 50%, in the year 2000, we had to do a 1% per year change to do something, to keep up. If we do nothing, as each year goes by, you have to do a heavier lift to keep up. And by the time you get to 50 years, now you have to do 2% per year to keep up. So maybe we have done something in the past 21 years, but there's been sufficient poo-pooing of climate change. We had to change it from climate warming to climate change. But even now, you know, fuel in the United States, the carbon industry is robust, and they have Mitch McConnell in their pocket and whatnot. We're not doing a whole lot. So the sea level rise is going to be incrementally moving along. And at some point, we're going to say, wow, why didn't we do something?
Yeah, I mean, the point about compounding backwards and forwards is absolutely crucial in every respect, and particularly when I think about my grandkids, you know, and their kids and so forth. It's like everything we do this year makes their life one, you know, heck of a lot safer, calmer, and happier. The good news, I think, is that while the US has been at best inconsistent in what we've done, and I would say childish in many ways, in part for ignoring exactly what you've just said, Bob, is that meanwhile, China is really moving ahead seriously. You know, Denmark and Germany provide pretty good models of how you can move ahead seriously. Downing and Phil will show us good models of what states can do to move ahead, and towns and localities. And, you know, even some of the developing countries beyond China that don't have China's resources or technology or the ability to steer their economies, you know, so tightly and firmly, are doing, you know, some important things. So it's also useful, I think, to look outward and see models of good behavior. Yeah, sure, Eloise.
I just wanted to say, we're at the Cape right now, and over at the Audubon, I take my grandchildren there every time they come, and they have these sticks in the sand that indicate where the tide will rise in the year that it will rise, and even a 5-year-old interprets it and talks to you about it. So I was thinking about that, but I want to go back to what John was saying in the beginning about trying to somehow find ourselves in partnership with the earth as we face this. And one of the big challenges for me when we're out here and there's hurricanes and things like that is to not have a fear of the earth, but to try to find the sacred in it as it's coming crashing toward our cottage. So, I mean, I'm just saying, John, thank you. I have to struggle with this because I really do believe that there's sacredness in our partnership with the earth, but we've done so much to hurt it. And now I'm trying to say, forgive me and let me, as it's coming toward me. So it's just something as I think about us as First Churchers and as people who want to find that love and sacredness there.
Eleanor, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that probably the most striking slide in the slide set, and I viewed it earlier today, was the one that showed that the biggest impact is by not having one more child. And it just dwarfs all of the other things that we can do. And of course, this being an older group, we've done what we've done. That's behind us. Yeah, I'm looking at David Deese. But just more seriously, you talked about how China's taking steps. Well, China is also now pushing population growth. And they have gone from one child per couple and forced abortions to now strongly encouraging and paying bonuses and giving advantageous treatment to people who have more than one child. So, you know, it's not as straightforward as, you know, they're doing what's convenient for them to do, put it that way. But it's also helped me to understand why so many of the younger generation are really seriously talking about not having children. You know, I had 3 children and I'm going to have 3 grandchildren. One of my daughters is not going to have children. Now, I don't know everything involved in her decision, but I know that concern about the earth and climate is part of it. And I think for a lot of young people, that is as well, as not only from a global warming and carbon production standpoint, but also not believing that the consumerist capitalist model that we've grown up under is a sustainable model. And I think the truth is most of us know, if not all of us, that it's not a sustainable model. And I think embracing, you know, I mean, I'm sure John Bell will agree with a life of simplicity and decreased utilization of everything is what we need to do, as well as plant-based eating and so on. But it's seeing that number for each child was really very sobering for me.
Amen. But before Priscilla goes, I just want to make sure we do our duty here and say it is 9 o'clock and that was the commitment. So don't feel obligated. If you can stay on, you know, that would be lovely. Priscilla?
Well, I was just a question about that figure about 1 child. I assume that means under the current consumption, energy consumption models or patterns, that so that if you had a world where you could live more simply, then having another child wouldn't be, you know, wouldn't in itself have that effect. So I don't know. I just think that's important to take into consideration. That
Yeah, and I think if that child were born in Denmark, it would be very different from in parts of the United States, for example. So yeah, it does vary. And Eleanor, not at all to take issue with what you said, because it's absolutely true. But so far, at least, I don't know how much that change in policy is actually affecting the Chinese family's decisions, you know, because they're looking at the costs of having a second child and their own standard of living and their values and what they want for their first child, you know. So I don't know how that's going to work out. What else?
I had a few items. One is in technology. I liked what Jean said about the life cycle cost of things. If like concrete, if concrete was a country, it'd be the 3rd largest producer of CO2 emissions, which is kind of an interesting thought experiment. But I think some good news is coming through, like nuclear fusion. That may be a pipe dream, whatever, but they did generate like 20 Tesla to try to contain basically a sun on the Earth with nuclear fusion recently. So they're making some progress in that. I know another friend who's a CEO of a company who's doing thermal storage instead of batteries. She's doing thermal storage. They have a pilot in Germany, and I think they're going to do one in the US too. It's pretty big. I mean, they have some good funding from Google and whatnot. So that's interesting. Another fact I've heard is just like preserving oceans and forests, like you talked about, Dave, is like that captures more carbon than any man-made source of carbon capture, despite all of the funding that we put into it. And the Department of Energy has put a lot of funding into that. That's not gone very far. One other quick thing is the Obama administration, I forget what law or what regulation they tried to pass, but it was like they wanted to pass something that reduced emissions by 20%. Didn't pass, big failure, was written up in the newspaper, but we've gotten to the point where we've reduced the emissions by 21%. And the goal was 20%. So I guess I throw out that fact is the individual contributions we can make and just making our voices heard and just doing things and seeing the economic benefit of living a different way and following our passion to what John said really resonates with me. And I just like to wrap up on relationships. I thought, John, what you said about relationships really, all these facts from Dave are important on how this all works and how this all comes together in our talking points. But I've had 2 conversations with friends recently, one who reminded me of the book of Revelations and said, it's all coming true, Robert. And basically that's going to be it. And then another one who, is not concerned about climate change at all. And when I hear these things, I'm almost so affronted that I don't know what to say. I just want to keep peace and I don't say anything. But I think to invite a dialogue and share what I'm doing in terms of my own choices and my passion for it, and like the person in the KKK and the African American woman, starting those dialogues, I think could be very powerful, because even if the other side doesn't see it first, maybe at some point, because you were compassionate and empathetic, it comes through. So sorry that was long-winded, but a few things on my mind.
Alice has her hand up. I think you're muted, Alice.
I'll say this really quickly because I know it's late. I had a number of thoughts during this excellent presentation, but this is sort of one big thing that's sticking with me here at the end, and it's sort of related to the first principle and what John was talking about and some of the last comments we just heard. Do we really need to bring along 30 to 40% of our population who were captured by disinformation, misinformation from right-wing sources? Because if you can't use science and reason to talk to people or enter conversations that you can bring people along or gently help to guide people. I mean, if you're going to run into people like who just mentioned, I mean, I guess what I'm feeling is, how much time are we going to need to spend when there are other things to do? And we've got about 30 or 40% of our population that are just not going to be in the game with us, in terms of helping to improve things for the climate. What are we going to do about those people? Are we going to work and, hit our head against the wall? Or are we just going to forge forward and hope that there are enough of us and people are strong enough and do the right things to get through that?
That sounds to me like a good theme for the whole process this fall, because we're not going to be able to address it right now. But any thoughts, John or others? I mean, I could talk about the politics in the US of passing legislation.
Oh, yeah.
We're all reading the newspaper, and fingers crossed for.
Just there's not a single silver bullet, unfortunately. Nobody has the corner on what to do. There are estimated to be 1 million NGOs around the world who are working on some aspect of climate stuff. And then all the people that involve those million. So there's a lot of people thinking about this from lots of different perspectives. And I think we'll see, whether I have a teacher who said, the upward trend hopefully interrupts the downward trend before its total collapse. I think that's how we can hold this thing. Let's hope that the upward trend, that all of our efforts together turn the tide enough before we're all cooked.
I love seeing the thousands of youth gathered in Milan right now, being spurred on also by Greta Thunberg, and talking up the 400 youth who will join in Glasgow and talk up the delegates there. Maybe more important, hopefully it's the children at home of the people that need to make these decisions. So,
Yeah, in the Juliana versus the US court case, the young people have sued the United States government for endangering their future, which is unconstitutional. It's been passed on to the higher and higher courts. It's still alive. And so that could have tremendous implications for so many things. So who knows? That's working its way through too.
yeah.
Thank you all for caring and, thinking hard about this and willing to roll your sleeves up.
This has been remarkable. I really appreciate both of you for putting this together and really looking forward to the next session, which is in a couple of weeks. And we'll be putting out some more information about that and sending you the link for the registration. So thank you to all of you.
Great
Thank you.
gratitude to
Thank
David
you.
for putting it together.
Thanks, Lillian.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey,